It's great to have an opportunity to talk about World War I to people who really care about history. As most of you know, World War I is not a war most Americans think a lot about or seem to care a lot about. It's the only major American war which there's not a memorial to in Washington, D.C., even though there's a wonderful one in Kansas City. How many people have been to the World War I Museum in Kansas City? Oh, a good number of you. A great museum, by the way. I urge you to go. Not that far away, right? 500 miles or so, something like that, 600 miles. I'm pleased to start off a day of talks and discussions about World War I. And as Gary said, I'm going to talk, maybe a little unusual to start talking about the history of a war by talking about those who thought the United States should not go into the war at all, which is the topic of my book and the topic of my talk. And I want to start the talk by showing you photos of 4 leaders of what was really the largest anti-war movement in American history up to that point. In fact, the largest anti-war movement up until the movement against the Vietnam War that some of you were alive to witness, maybe some of you participated in, maybe some of you were very angry at the same time 50 years ago. But it doesn't get as much attention as that war did, in part, of course, because the United States won World War I and did not win the Vietnam War. 4 leaders of that movement 100 years ago, most of whom I think, well, at least many of whom, are not that familiar, even to historians. And I'm curious how many of you are familiar with them. I pushed the wrong button. Okay. Senator Robert La Follette, how many people are familiar with him? Probably the best known of these figures. Former governor of Wisconsin, leader of the progressive Republicans from the Midwest. People like George Norris, for example. Others from this part of the country. And he was really a leader of anti-war forces on the Republican side. Crystal Eastman, how many people have ever heard of her? The historians over there, yeah. You don't count, guys. Crystal Eastman was one of the sort of bravura organizers of this period. She was a leading organizer for suffrage. She actually led a pro-woman suffrage referendum movement in Wisconsin. She was a pioneer in getting New York City auto dealerships to hire women to sell cars to women, which was a very new idea at the time. And she was also a member of a sort of radical cultural group in Greenwich Village, which included her probably better known brother, Max Eastman, who was the editor of the Masses magazine, the leading and most creative radical magazine of the early 20th century. She was, for our purposes today, one of the lead organizers of the anti-war movement. She was the main organizer of the American Union Against Militarism, which I'll talk about in a little bit, a leading national anti-war organization which had put together a coalition with people like La Follette and others in Congress who opposed the war and activists against the war outside of Congress. And also she was the head of the New York branch of the Women's Peace Party, which was the largest women's organization, peace organization in American history, with about 40,000 members. And New York City had the largest single contingent of the Women's Peace Party. Morris Hillquit. Historians, you can put up your hands if you've heard of him. Okay, David has. Morris Hillquit was born in Riga, Latvia. His first language was German. He also knew Russian and English. He was Jewish, but when he didn't learn Yiddish, that is, the Jewish language spoken by most working class Jews in New York City in the United States, until he came to this country and got into politics and had to communicate with his fellow Jews in the language that they understood best. He was the leader of the international part of the International Secretary of the Socialist Party of America at a time when the Socialist Party was as powerful and as large as ever been in American history, with over 120,000 members at one point. with thousands of elected officials in various towns and cities in America at some time between 1900 and 1920. And he wrote most of the anti-war statements that came out in the name of the Socialist Party, both before the United States gets into the war in April 1917 and after that as well. And in many ways, his main claim to fame as an anti-war figure was he ran for mayor of New York City in 1917, off-year election, got almost a quarter of the vote in a four-man race, and Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, of course, was prosecuting the war, was so afraid that he actually might win the election in the largest city in the country, one of the largest cities in the world, New York City, that the Justice Department talked about indicting Hillquit under the Espionage Act before the election. So he'd have a hard time running from jail, or at least under trial. But that did not happen. He did not win. He was not elected, but this was a sign of how much anti-war feeling there was in New York City, even 8-9 months after the United States went to war. And finally, Claude Kitchin. Nobody, right? This often happens to me. Claude Kitchin was the leader of anti-war Democrats in Congress. He was a congressman from the 2nd District of North Carolina, northeastern North Carolina. From our point of view today, his career was not a glorious one before he got involved in anti-war activity. I don't think it was glorious then either. He was part of the white supremacist campaign in North Carolina that, in effect, drove black people out of the polls, helped disenfranchise African-American voters in North Carolina, which was one of the last states in the South actually to disenfranchise African-American voters. And when he was elected to Congress in 1900, the man he replaced in Congress was a guy named George White, who was the last African-American congressman from the South, the last African-American from the South in Congress until Barbara Jordan from Texas, more than 6 decades later. But he was opposed to war. He thought war was something which was pushed by Wall Street, by big corporations. He thought the United States should stay out of the conflict. And he also was opposed to preparing the American military, to boosting the size of the American military to be ready to fight a war if President Wilson decided to try to send the country to war. He was majority leader of the House of Representatives, a very powerful position, of course. And also he was chair of the Ways and Means Committee, the tax writing committee in the House. And so he was responsible, at least at the beginning, of writing tax bills, revenue bills, to fund the war. Even though he voted against the war, one of the 50 congressmen to vote against the war, he kept his position as House Majority Leader, and he kept his position as chair of the Ways and Means Committee. And during the period of American belligerence, from April 1917 until November 1918, he made sure, as much as he could, that rich Americans would pay more for the war, because he believed the rich were more in favor of the war, therefore they should pay more for the war. He wasn't completely successful, but income taxes went up a lot during the war. There was a thing called the excess profit tax, which went up, which was impinged on corporations during the war. And he was more responsible than anybody else in Congress for getting those laws passed. I show you these 4 figures because each was, as I said, really a leader of a different group in the anti-war coalition. It was a true coalition, as you can see, going from white supremacist Southern Democrats to progressive Northern Republicans to socialists and feminists, and there are other groups as well, which I'll talk about. But those are the 4 really major groups. Let me clear up one common misconception about this movement. In textbooks still, you see this movement, you see those who opposed America going to war described as isolationists, the I word, as I've come to call it. Many things in textbooks are true. Most of them, in fact. I've written one myself about the 1960s, but this one's not, at least for the major activists in the war. All of them, in different ways, with a possible exception of Kitchin, were deeply engaged in building a world order based on a socialized democracy, based on peaceful, cooperative relationships between national states. They all wanted, in effect, what Woodrow Wilson wanted. They wanted a world made safe for democracy. They wanted a world in which World War I would be the last war that would take place. They wanted a system of international arbitration. But they thought if the U.S. went to war, it would make that impossible. We can argue later about whether that was true or not. And they were up against... sometime, maybe a few weeks, a few months before the U.S. actually declares war in April 1917. That's not true either. There was a formidable lobby, you might say, in coalition of well-organized groups and individuals, very popular individuals like this guy in the middle, Theodore Roosevelt, still one of the most popular politicians in America, even though he was not elected in 1912 when he ran against Wilson and Taft. They organized groups called the National Security League, which had tens of thousands of members, most of them upper middle class. The Navy League and the Army League, which wanted to boost the size of the military. Most big circulation daily newspapers in the major cities were in favor of preparing the U.S. to go to war, and then were beating the drums for the U.S. to go to war several months before the U.S. actually does go to war. So the people I'm talking about then, the Anti-War Coalition, had very powerful opponents and well-funded opponents as well. The pro-war coalition, if you will, was always much better funded than the Anti-War Coalition. Now to the narrative of the movement. Well, first, as most of you probably know, the Great War appalled Woodrow Wilson and appalled the great majority of his fellow Americans. It's certainly true in 1914 and the first part of 1915, first few months of 1915, that if you had public opinion polls back then, which you did not, you would not have gotten anything close to a majority saying the United States should join the British, join the French, join the Russians against Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, the major belligerents on both sides. A few days after war begins in Europe, a couple weeks actually after war begins in Europe, August 19th, President Wilson makes a statement, a very short statement, recognizing that, quote, the people of the United States are drawn from many nations, and chiefly from the nations now at war. Notice he's talking about what an immigrant nation America really was at the time. Wilson urged them to stay neutral in thought as well as deed. Otherwise, the one great nation still at peace would be unable to mediate the conflict. When and if he decided as president that it was a good time to mediate the conflict. He kept teasing people who didn't want the U.S. to get into war, that at some point he would jump in and offer himself as an honest mediator, honest broker between the two sides. But when he actually tried to do that, it came very late in December 1916, after he'd been reelected. And so it seemed that Wilson wanted the U.S. to stay neutral in 1914. And that was true, of course, till he goes to Congress April 2nd, 1917, and asks Congress to give him a declaration of war. However, through the diplomatic policies Wilson chose to adopt, I think he undermined his own neutral rhetoric. I think he made U.S. intervention on the side of the Allies, the Triple Entente, as they were known at the time, probable, if not inevitable. Because Wilson did nothing to compel American business to stay neutral, either in thought or in deed. And wars are a matter of resources, as we all know. You need clothing, you need food, you need guns, and various other kinds of war material, ammunition. And you need money as well. By 1915, J.P. Morgan and Company, the largest investment house in the United States, had become the commission agent for the British Empire. When the British bought American goods, which they bought tons and tons and tons of American goods in 1915 and 16 and 17 and 18, they bought them through J.P. Morgan and Company, and J.P. Morgan and Company got a 1% commission on everything the British bought. Might not sound like much, but it adds up into the many hundreds of millions, and it did add up. American food, American steel were keeping the British war effort going. through 15 and 16, and the French war effort to as well. All that aid, not coincidentally, helped lift the United States out of a serious recession in 1913, 1914. By 1915, 1916, America was not at full employment, but it was closer than it had been in a long, long time. Now, Wilson's choice to threaten war over just one side's violation of neutral rights, that is Germany's submarine warfare, and not the other side's, Britain's blockade of the North Sea, the only sea route into Germany, had a fateful consequence. Given the superiority of the British Navy on the North Atlantic, submarine warfare was the only effective military response the Germans could have made to the blockade of their country, which, by the way, thousands, tens of thousands of people died, older people and children especially, from hunger and disease. So one could argue it was only a matter of time before the Germans' U-boat attacks provoked the United States into declaring war, because so much American goods were going overseas and were so necessary to the Allies' war effort. Of course, Wilson's choice was not an irrational one, given the realities of international law and realities of war itself. The North Atlantic, unlike the North Sea, was a lifeline for U.S. commerce. If the U.S. couldn't get goods to Germany through the North Sea, it wasn't a big deal. But the North Atlantic was essential, of course, for U.S. trade with Europe. And for the Germans to destroy neutral ships, to kill neutral Americans, was a violation of existing international law. There was no restriction whatsoever on neutral countries doing business with belligerents. Now, the British blockade, it was argued, certainly by the Germans, was also violating the rather vague and spongy statutes of global jurisprudence at the time. One sort of ironic joke about the British way of interpreting the law was Britannia rules the waves and waves the rules. But the president was also emotionally on the side of the British. His mother had been born in Britain. His greatest political heroes were great British statesmen, Edmund Burke, William Gladstone, and the Lake District was his favorite place on earth. He could have spent his whole life there if he could have. And less than a month after Europeans went to war, Wilson told his closest advisor, Colonel Edward House, that a German victory, quote, would change the course of our civilization. It would make the United States a militarist nation. So when in 1917 he called on both sides to make a peace without victory, his last important speech before he asked the U.S. to go to war, he really couldn't follow through on that emotionally or, from his point of view, strategically. As much as he wished the United States could remain neutral, Woodrow Wilson could not really choose not to care who won the Great War. And in the end, the American decision to intervene played a critical role in the Allied triumph in that war. What turned the tide against Germany was not the actual fighting done by U.S. troops, nearly all of which occurred during the final 6 months of the conflict. It was the fact that the Kaiser's generals recognized that they could not, their tired troops, the teenagers who in many ways were fighting German battles on the Western Front by 1918. They could not withstand 2 million fresh American troops coming to the battlefield, which they did by the summer of 1918, and another 2 million who were being trained and could have come to the battlefield in France by 1919, if the war had gone on that long. So the Kaiser's generals made a decision that they had to throw all they could into a series of final offensives in the spring of 1918 up until the early summer of 1918. When those offensives failed, they were finished. Now, American troops fought several smaller battles, but they really fought just one big battle in the war, which lasted from early September until Armistice Day, November 11th, 1918. And it was the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne in northeastern France. In fact, this is the bloodiest battle in American history. Over 26,000 Americans died in this one battle. And the German commanders made very clear that they had to win the war before the US troops came in large numbers. General Erich Ludendorff, one of the two major commanders of the German army, by 1918, together with Hindenburg, said, quote, "We must strike before America can throw her forces into the scales." And they did strike. They did not take over Paris as they wanted to, and then the war was lost. Now, millions of Americans viewed with alarm both the preparedness crusade, as it was called, the crusade to build up the size of the military, that Theodore Roosevelt, the National Security League, the Army League, the Navy League were in favor of, and then the decision to go to war itself. And a concerned minority, the people I've written my book about, organized the largest, most diverse, and most sophisticated anti-war coalition to that point in US history. And to emphasize again the point I made at the beginning, it was a very broad coalition. Opponents of militarism, as they called themselves, could be found in nearly every corner of the social and economic landscape. And it was begun by women. The first organization, the first demonstration against the war on American soil was organized entirely by women and participated in only by women. They banned men from participating at all. And it came out of what was then a very large and powerful feminist movement, of which winning the right to vote, of course, was the most important issue, but there are other issues as well, like having women be able to sell cars to women, as I mentioned. This is a photo of the march. There were about 1,500 women, as you see, many dressed in black to signify mourning, or wearing black armbands if they were dressed in white. There were women from over 20 different countries, including all the belligerent countries, but nobody was allowed to carry a flag, and no politicians were allowed in the march either, even though Woodrow Wilson sent a note saying he was in favor of it. There were perhaps 15 or 20,000 New Yorkers who were lined the streets along Fifth Avenue to watch the march go by. And it got very positive coverage in the daily press. The main organizer of the march was a 69-year-old activist named Fanny Villard. Her middle name ought to be familiar to you. She was the daughter of William Lloyd Garrison, the famous abolitionist, one of the leaders, of course, of the movement to abolish slavery in this country. And Fanny Villard had, grown up within reform circles, and for her, peace was the most important issue that she could imagine. Interviewed after the march, she said, "It was only a feeble effort, really, but we have cast a pebble into the water. I hope there may be ever-widening circles that perhaps will make men realize what a crime it is to send thousands of husbands and fathers and sons to a useless slaughter." And the circles did widen, in fact, and rather quickly. That fall, two European feminists, one British, one Hungarian, took a trip around the country to try to organize women to oppose the war. In January 1915, a conference of 3,000 American women met at the Willard Hotel right next to the White House in Washington, D.C., and founded the Women's Peace Party, by far the largest anti-war organization in the country at that time, and probably the largest organization at that point in American history that women have been involved in, up until the suffrage movement, that is. Every major suffrage activist was part of the anti-war coalition. The leaders of the leading suffrage organization at the time, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, better known as NAWSA, were all part of the Women's Peace Party. And the head of the Women's Peace Party was Jane Addams. Most of you know, charismatic woman who was sort of into everything in terms of reform. She had founded the Hull Street Settlement House, of course, in South Side of Chicago. But she also was involved in labor and anti-boss politics, and as well as peace and immigrant education, as well as trying to diminish the amount of poverty in American society. And the feminist argument against war was a very powerful argument at the time. Here's Jane Addams. I won't use laser pointer. She's right here to the, I guess, my right, your left. The second one there with the big corsage on her lapel. This is a photo taken of members of the Women's Peace Party who were delegated by the Women's Peace Party to go to The Hague, the capital of neutral Netherlands, in 1915, to take part in a women's peace conference at The Hague. Again, only women involved, at which there were some delegates from Britain and some delegates from Germany and from Belgium, countries that were at war with one another at that time, who had very wary handshakes. But the idea was women will stop the war. War is a male thing. It's aggressive. Women have no interest in war. Women have interest in bringing up children and nurturing society, not breaking it apart. Whatever you think of that argument, it was a very powerful argument at the time. So powerful that the most popular song in America in 1915 was a song which was inspired by the Women's Peace Party, inspired by this argument. Written by a man and sung by a man, a Canadian, as it turns out, named Alfred Brown. But you see from the lyrics the sentiments behind the song. And you play a little bit of the music. You get a, whoops, I lost my, oh no, here it is. There'd be no war today if mothers all would say, I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier. Naive, but nevertheless quite heartfelt. Why do we know it's the most popular song in America, by the way? Anybody guess? Billboard magazine wasn't around anymore. There was no Spotify, no Pandora, no Casey Kasem, no. Well, maybe Casey, he seems ageless. Is he still alive? I don't know. Anybody guess? This is historians might know. The historians over there might know, but interesting question. We had no public opinion polls, but there was a, more or less accurate way of knowing what the most popular songs. Yes? You got it. Sales of the sheet music. Sales of the sheet music. Yeah. I mean, if you wanted to play the song, you had to have the sheet music. There were some very rough cylinders, you could play, but there are basically no records yet. So it's the sheet music. If you wanted to play it, at your piano or in the bar or wherever, of course you needed the music. 800,000 roughly copies of the sheet music were sold in 1915 of this song. By far the most popular song of 1915. No Grammys yet either. So. At the same time, a group of prominent progressives and radicals were meeting regularly in New York City to publicize the evils of war and persuade the president and Congress to remain neutral. And this was the American Union Against Militarism. And it was a sort of a cross-section of various reform figures. Two of the leading ones were the leading social worker, settlement house worker, an organizer in New York, Lillian Wald, who ran the Henry Street Settlement House, where my grandmother worked long ago, and Paul Kellogg, who edited the major reform journal in many ways in America, at least that focused on social problems like poverty, war, sanitation, industrial accidents, labor, and also peace and war. This group included a left-wing philanthropist who helped to fund it, Amos Pinchot, Oswald Villard, Fanny Villard's son, who was editor of the New York Evening Post and the publisher of The Nation, Rabbi Stephen Wise, who was the most important leader of Reform Judaism in America at the time, David Starr Jordan, former president of Stanford University and a renowned biologist. And it was led by Crystal Eastman, who I mentioned to you before. And it became the main coordinator of anti-war activity on the East Coast and in the Midwest, had chapters around the country. But the Anti-War Coalition was not just one of middle-class feminists, middle-class reformers. It included a large number of union members, perhaps even a majority. Although the leader of the American Federation of Labor, Samuel Gompers, was not among them. He was born in Britain. He was always wanted the U.S. to side with Britain and not necessarily go to war with Britain right away. Every prominent socialist railed against preparedness. Morris Hillquit was by far not the only one at all. And at the time, the socialists had about a third of the delegates to most of the American Federation of Labor conventions. So socialists were a major force, not just in Greenwich Village and Berkeley, California, where they were a major force even then, or in Cambridge, Massachusetts, places like that. They were a major force in working class communities around the country, including many in Ohio, and also in labor unions. Opposing going to war up until the U.S. actually goes to war were officials of major unions like the Mine Workers Union, the Clothing Workers Union, the Textile Workers Union, the Ladies Garment Workers Union, and the Butchers, as well as many building trades locals. In fact, the Toledo Labor Council, up the highway here, what, about 100 miles? Went on record in 1916 saying, if the U.S. goes to war, we want all workers in Toledo to go on strike. They were threatening a general strike against going to war. Didn't happen, but the congressman from Toledo, this is a real trivia question. Anybody know who the congressman was from Toledo in 1916 and 1917? Isaac Sherwood, who was 81 years old. He was a general from the Civil War, from the Union Army. And in fact, he was the only veteran of Civil War to vote against going to war in 1917. One of the 50 congresspeople who voted against going to war. And he said, I'm voting against going to war because my constituents are against going to war. And that's why I'm voting against going to war. Though he was against it himself anyway. As the movement blossomed, it attracted powerful allies in Congress, as I mentioned, from both Republican and Democratic parties. The Democratic opponents were led by Claude Kitchen in the House, but also outside the halls of Congress, there was a very powerful Democrat who opposed going to war and proposed preparing for war as well. This guy, William Jennings Bryan, who I wrote a biography about. Bryan was Secretary of State, 1913, 1914, early 1915. He resigned as Secretary of State in June 1915 because he thought after the Lusitania, that famous British ocean liner, was torpedoed by the British with over 120 Americans dying, that the United States was going to go to war. He thought Woodrow Wilson was making such demands on the Germans that they would lead the U.S. to go to war in 1915. So he resigned as Secretary of State. The first Secretary of State in American history to resign on principle, by the way. Anybody know who the second was? This is unfair. This is not a history class. But Cyrus Vance, Jimmy Carter's Secretary of State, who didn't like the increasing belligerence of the United States against the Soviets in the late 1970s. Bryan gave lots of speeches, as you might know. He was known as a great orator. He wasn't a very good Secretary of State, but he was a very good orator. And so he could fill halls anywhere in the country, pretty much any time. And he was filling it in 1916, early 1917 with anti-war speeches. Also, as Woodrow Wilson had referred to Americans from all these different lands, and we can't go to war because enmity will increase between these people. America was, especially in big cities and industrial areas, an immigrant country at that time. Of course, the immigrants, unlike now, came mostly from Europe, Eastern, Southern, Northern, and Western Europe. And they did have very different loyalties to the countries, because of the countries they came from. Irish Catholics were not crazy about the US going to war to help the British Empire, which of course was still holding Ireland in thrall. Russian Jews and Jews from Eastern Europe were not happy about the US going to war to support Tsar Nicholas, one of the most notorious anti-Semites in the world. And of course, Germans, Austro-Hungarians were not happy about going to war to support, to fight against their former countrymen. So there was a lot of ethnic unhappiness about US getting towards the war. And of course, the Anti-War Coalition included people like that. And one illustration of that is a mass meeting, notice, international mass meeting, which took place at the headquarters of the offices of a very popular Yiddish language newspaper, The Forward, in Lower East Side of New York City, newspaper that sold 250,000 copies every day in Yiddish, in Jewish. And you notice the speakers, two in English, two in Yiddish, two in Russian, one in Italian. And these kind of meetings were taking place a lot. And notice also it's the Ladies' Waist and Dressmakers Union as one of the sponsors as well. So this is just in one poster, one meeting, a good example of the ethnic variety just in New York City at the time. The tactics of the activists, I could talk for a long time. There's a lot in my book about it, and I won't bore you with them. But if you've ever been involved in a movement, you've ever been involved in any kind of political activism, whether for a candidate or otherwise, there's a lot of interesting ways you can promote your cause. You can promote your candidate. And the Anti-War Coalition had very some imaginative ideas about that. They obviously had demonstrations. They collected petitions, names on petitions. They packed urban arenas for protest rallies. Madison Square Garden in New York was packed quite often. They ran peace candidates for state and federal office, like Morris Hillquit for mayor of New York in 1917. And at the end, really at the end of the period of American neutrality, February, March 1917, the Anti-War Coalition put a lot of their effort into trying to get a national referendum held to ask Americans, do you really want to go to war? Do you really want to go to war? They thought, well, the people are going to fight the war. The people with their tax dollars, with buying war bonds, are going to finance the war. They should maybe get to vote on it as well. Now, this is not in the Constitution, as you know. War can only be declared by Congress, or for the last few decades, by the president. Congress goes along or doesn't go along. But this was, of course, didn't happen. But it shows, I think, the confidence that people in the Anti-War Coalition had, that they were willing to put the question up to a vote, even though they were pretty sure that would not happen. And they also, as I said, kind of creative tactics. In New York City, in 1916, peace advocates, led by Crystal Eastman and her then lover, put together an exhibit they called War Against War, which featured various anti-war cartoons, lots of speakers, and various exhibits, the most popular of which was a life-size papier-mâché model of a stegosaurus with the caption, he had all armor plate and no brains. And one of the most famous Americans was part of the Anti-War Coalition as well. Someone you've all heard of. This guy, Henry Ford, who in 1915 chartered a Norwegian ship, filled it with American anti-war activists and journalists, and sailed off to Norway, where he hoped and planned that they would sort of organized other other activists from neutral nations to try to force somehow, he wasn't quite sure how, the belligerent nations to come to a peace agreement. He promised in November 1915, when he chartered the ship, we'll get the boys out of the trenches by Christmas. A little ambitious. But he was vociferously opposed to the war. Before he sailed for Europe, Ford declared with his characteristic bluntness, quote, "To my mind, the word murderer should be embroidered in red letters across the breast of every soldier." Henry Ford, the most popular and most famous industrialist in America at the time. Father of the Model T, the 5-hour day, Highland Park factory. And of course, in Congress, the Anti-War Coalition had some very important supporters, who I mentioned, La Follette and Kitchen and others. And they fought basically at first to try to pass laws to stop Americans from traveling on the ships of belligerent nations, like the Lusitania. It was after Lusitania was torpedoed that they tried to get these different bills passed. And if Woodrow Wilson hadn't worked really hard, a couple of them would have been passed in 1916. And also, they met in the White House with Wilson a lot. And I can talk in the question period more about, which I promise I will give you time to ask questions, about the relationship of the peace activists with Wilson, because it was a complicated relationship. Because Wilson did tell them he wanted the U.S. to stay neutral. Wilson did say he was opposed to people like Theodore Roosevelt, who they really hated one another, Roosevelt and Wilson, and didn't want the U.S. to have a much bigger military than it already had. But at the same time, he did not go through with his vow to try to mediate the peace. But he kept meeting with people like Jane Addams and Crystal Eastman and Max Eastman, even Morris Hillquit in the White House, and made them think he was on their side in 1915 and 1916. Well, what motivated these people? I want to sort of wrap up here. So it's time to ask questions, and we have time for discussion. A couple major motivations, I think. First of all, they did believe that a world without war, a world of democratic nations, they thought that was necessary, autocratic nations, tyrannies they thought would always go to war, was possible. And if the U.S. went to war, it would make that impossible, because they wanted America to be a force for peace. They wanted America to truly be the exceptional nation in the worldwide framework. If the U.S. goes to war, they say that's not going to be possible. The second argument was largely a defensive one, symbolized by this defensive and cynical one, symbolized by this cartoon by Art Young, left-wing cartoonist in The Masses, the magazine edited by Crystal Eastman's brother, Max. It's not subtle, obviously. Reminds me of a slogan from the anti-war movement during the Vietnam era, 1960s. War is good business, invest your son. Basically the same message here. Why is it in America, the interest of ordinary Americans to go to war? People in the Anti-War Coalition argued. What's in it for them? Why should we go to France to bail out these empires, fighting other empires? Why is that good for the United States? We're already making lots of money selling stuff to them. Why should we go and invest our sons, in effect? So you had both of those arguments. And at base, and this is a sort of interesting way to look at it, I think, even socialists like Morris Hillquit, progressives like La Follette and Crystal Eastman, anarchists like Emma Goldman, who I haven't got time to talk about, who's also a very important anti-war figure, anti-draft figure too, were in some ways making a conservative argument. Not in the sense of ideological conservatism, but in the sense of America is reforming right now, they argued. It's becoming more democratic. It's becoming fairer to workers, fairer to small farmers to a degree. People are alert to the problems of the poor in a way they really haven't been before. This is progressive America. Why should we jeopardize that by going to war? One of the senators who voted against U.S. going to war in 1917, chaired the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, rather important figure. William Stone from Missouri said, as you say, I won't vote for this war because if we go into it, we will never again have the same old republic. They were afraid of a militarized state, a state that primary goal was to keep the national security and would do that by perhaps having soldiers around the world at military bases and maybe get into wars in places like the Middle East and elsewhere, instead of devoting American tax dollars to Americans at home. That sounds like a familiar argument. It's not surprising. Anti-war movements have made that kind of argument ever since then. This was the first time they really made the argument. Well, a little bit about, before breaking for questions and comments and disagreements, perhaps, a little bit about what happens to the anti-war movement once America does go to war. Again, there's a textbook wisdom, dictum, conventional wisdom, that once America goes to war, yes, there was an anti-war feeling in a movement before, but it collapses. It collapses because it's repressed by the government, espionage and sedition acts. It collapses because Americans, even those who are not sure about going to war ahead of time, go very gung-ho for the war. They start singing, instead of, I don't want my boy to be a soldier, they start singing Over There by George M. Cohan. And that is a big change. There's a draft for the first time since the Civil War. And the draft, according to the conventional wisdom, is very popular. American men rush to register, happy to go in, happy to learn how to fight. Well, this is not entirely wrong, of course, but it neglects two important details. One, why, if there was so much support for the war and so little anti-war movement, did the government pass the Espionage and Sedition Acts? Why did they use them to crack down on anti-war activity? There were anti-war demonstrations. There were anti-war meetings, big ones in 1917 at least. There were candidates running in 1917, also as I mentioned, in the fall elections who opposed the war, socialists especially, and they got a lot of votes. They won offices in a lot of places around the country. So they knew there was still a lot of opposition to the war. And so the Espionage and Sedition Acts, as draconian as they were, they basically said, if you oppose the war in any way, this could be illegal and we could prosecute you. There were fine details, but that, by 1918, that's pretty much what it amounted to. You don't pass laws like that if you think that you don't need them. And the government thought they needed them. Also, the draft itself was not quite as popular as a lot of textbook renderings have it. Yes, 10 million men registered for the draft, but 3 million men never bothered to register at all. Yes, most people who were called up for duty went and did their duty, did their service. But about 350,000 of those who registered for the draft either did not report as required or deserted from their training camps and never got to Europe at all. Black Americans who suffered under Jim Crow laws and Jim Crow customs were particularly loath to risk their lives in a war for democracy when they themselves did not enjoy democracy at home. But lots of white Southerners opposed the war as well. So the anti-war movement did continue during the war, though obviously it had to do so in a much more muted way. And it did so a lot by trying to stop, trying to make it easier to be a conscientious objector from the draft. This is an anti-conscription poster, of course, showing a conscientious objector as Christ, rather controversial image. And people who had been opposed to the war, like Crystal Eastman, who don't want to go to jail, begin talking about, well, we don't like the war, but what we really want to do is defend those who are being prosecuted for being opposed to the war. And so they founded a new organization to do that called the National Civil Liberties Bureau, NCLB. That organization changed its name in 1920 to one you've all heard of, the American Civil Liberties Union. It began as an organization to defend those prosecuted for opposing the war. Well, Woodrow Wilson, of course, goes to Paris in 1919, signs his peace agreement. which sets up the League of Nations, but as you probably know, the U.S. does not. U.S. Senate, under the control of Republicans, by 1919 does not ratify the peace agreement. The U.S. does not join the League of Nations. And the war, and by the mid-1920s, most Americans think the war has been a mistake. In fact, by mid-1930s, we have public opinion polls, finally. How can historians do without them? And public opinion polls make very clear most Americans thought the war had been a mistake. In fact, in the mid-30s to late 30s, Congress passes a series of neutrality acts to try to stop the U.S. from going into a future European war, which basically bar Americans from doing things like traveling on the ships of belligerent nations, exactly the kind of thing that anti-war Congress people wanted to do in 1916, but didn't get them passed. They passed easily 20 years later. Well, there's a lot else to be said about this movement, I think, and a lot else to be said about, I think, why anti-war movements in history are not as well known, perhaps, as other kinds of social movements. Conservative movement, black freedom movement, labor movement, women's movement, gay and lesbian movements, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're interested in that, I'm happy to talk about that in the question period. So thank you, and open it up for questions. I don't know if, is there amplification for the questions? I'm not sure you'll need them, but is there a microphone or something? No? Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Just project like I'm on a soccer field.
You're doing great. You're doing great.
Thank you very much. That was an eye-opener because I was unaware of most of that. You referred to Henry Ford as being part of this movement, and apologies if this treads into the next or the other sessions, but you know, once we did get into the war, I mean, you would think that any industrial factory would be turned into munitions and tanks and
I see where you're going.
really step up production. So what happened? How did he evolve? What happened at Ford?
He changed his mind, clearly.
Okay.
Once he was winning the war, he said, well, there's money to be made here. Though he still wasn't crazy about it. And afterwards, he actually runs for the Senate from Michigan in 1918 on an anti-war platform. And he doesn't win. That's a very good year for Republicans. Republicans take over both houses of Congress in the midterm election in 1918. But he might still have won, except he decided, I'm not going to campaign. I'm Henry Ford. So he loses. But he wins as a Wilsonian. And Wilson, I mean, I'm short, I don't want to short circuit other talks, but as you might know, I mean, Wilson, even if the US goes to war, continues to say, I'm for peace without victory. In January 1918, he gives this amazing speech called the 14-point speech, where laying out a future world order, which is democratic and peaceful and harmonious and has a League of Nations, a world federation of nations in it. And so it was, some people in the anti-war movement said, okay, we oppose going to war, but if we get this kind of peace, maybe that's okay. So there are people in the anti-war movement who became somewhat pro-Wilson at that point as well. Yes?
On Netflix, there's a series by Oliver Stone. Sounds like he may well have been quoted in it multiple times. Many of the photos that you've referenced are quoted there. He makes an eye-opening point that the reparations sought in Germany were heavily driven by loans from J.P. Morgan and others to be very repressive in the defeated countries of Germany and predisposed to the Second World War. I wonder if you have any comments about that?
Well, I hope I'm not quoted in that, because I don't think Oliver Stone's a very good historian. But actually, that series he did a series on Showtime, which is based on a book that was written by a former colleague of mine, Peter Kazin at American University. But anyway, I won't get into inside baseball here. The reparations question is an interesting one. Maybe my colleagues who speak later on have different points of view about it. I think, in fact, the Germans, tried to delay reparations as long as they could, ended up actually paying fewer reparations far fewer than they had agreed to pay. I mean, after all, their economy was in terrible shape. under the Weimar Republic in the 20s. And there were various plans made to make deals, one called the Dawes Plan, which were attempts to give them an out from some of this. But it's true that the U.S. had loans to Britain and France, many of which were not paid back. But I think the idea that the U.S. goes to war for economic reasons is just, now it was, as I said, the U.S. was doing very well. American industry was doing great. Not Henry Ford, but others supplying goods to the Allies. And the idea that, especially Wilson, who was, whatever you think of him, tremendously idealistic figure, I think, really thought he could save the world. Then he goes to war just to bail out J.P. Morgan. That doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to any of his biographers. And I mean, look, Oliver Stone believes that, there are about 1,000 people involved in the conspiracy to kill JFK too. So, if you've seen the movie, and he still holds to that, so, including Lyndon Johnson. So, I won't start arguing about that. But there were a few other hands up. I think. Yes, sir.
Yeah, a couple of people you didn't mention. Surprisingly, was Jeanette Rankin.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. I was going to get to her. So.
You only had two.
Yeah, I've got a photo of her. Go ahead.
You only had the Cold War.
Right.
And the other was Eugene Dent.
Yep.
Who fits in the party?
Jeanette Rankin. Yeah, Jeanette Rankin was a Republican congresswoman from Missoula, Montana. She was a feminist and a suffragist. There's a photo in my book of her speaking right before the declaration of war from the headquarters of the National Association of Women's Suffrage in Washington, D.C. And she was the only woman, the first woman in Congress, and she was asked to give a speech on the floor of Congress about, as the House was debating in early April 1917 whether to go to war or not. And she'd never given a speech before in Congress. She'd just been elected and just taken office. Back then, new Congress didn't take office till March. That's when the president, new term began as well, not January 20th. And so she hadn't given a speech before. And she was asked to give a speech, and I can't quote it directly. I wish I had brought my book. But basically she said, I can't speak for American women, but I think it's a mistake to go to war. And she sat down. But she did oppose the war. And in fact, 50 years later, when she's a pretty elderly woman, women who were opposing, women in the women's liberation movement, who were opposing going to the Vietnam War, put together what they call the Jeanette Rankin Brigade. And they march from Union Station in Washington, the main railroad station, to the Capitol, not a very long march. And they present a petition, women opposing the war, to John McCormick, who was then the Speaker of the House, who was a World War I veteran. So it's interesting, 50 years later, you have a World War I veteran being presented a petition written by feminists who are named after Jeanette Rankin, and Jeanette Rankin is there to present the petition. So, as Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes.
She was elected to a second term
Yes.
in 1940.
1940, yeah, and then she opposed the war. Yeah, and she was the only person to vote against going to World War II, which was when America, of course, was directly attacked at Pearl Harbor. And Debs, yes, Debs. Well, Debs was the most important leader of the Socialist Party of America, not Hillquit, but he was involved in lots of things, and Hillquit was mainly involved during the war, in the war. That's why I profile him. Also, I like to profile people who people don't know about. Debs is pretty well known. But as you might know, Debs goes to jail on a 10-year sentence for giving a speech in Canton, Ohio at a Socialist Party picnic in July 1918, in which it's a fairly, if you read it, it's a fairly standard socialist diatribe against going to war. War is not good for the working class. It's only for the rich. The kind of sentiment that Art Young was portraying in that cartoon I showed you. But there's Justice Department officials there, and they write it down. They put him up on trial, and he admits that he opposed the war and opposed the draft, and so he goes to war. And of course, one of the best things from my point of view President Harding ever did was to pardon him in 1921. He gets out of jail at the Atlanta Penitentiary in 1921. And actually, in 1920, he runs for the 5th time for president on the Socialist Party ticket from jail. There are little buttons that they made showing I forget the number, his number as a prisoner from the federal penitentiary. Vote for prisoner number, blah, 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 blah. And he gets almost 1 million votes, about 4% of the vote in 1920. Other questions? Yes?
You ask the average person of how America got into World War I, they will say the sinking of the Lusitania. And yet nobody ever, there's very little mention ever of the Zimmerman telegram. Why?
Yeah. Well, of course, Lusitania is not why the U.S. went to war. In fact, after Lusitania, it's a complicated story, but basically, by early 1916, the Germans agreed to sign something called the Sussex Pledge. After a ship called the Sussex is sunk with some Americans being lost, they say they will only sink neutral ships and civilian vessels in general if they give those vessels a time to get the people off the boat, and then they will sink the ship. They abide by that to a certain degree, but then in February 1917, they decide, we have to defeat the British and the French, and then still the Russians sooner. And also, even then, they were afraid of Americans, coming to the war. So they go back on the Sussex Pledge. And from February 1917 up until April, there's 2 months there. That's really the period when America is sort of rushing towards war. Before then, the anti-war movement had a chance, I think, to stop the U.S. from going to war. After that, it was much more difficult, perhaps impossible. Zimmerman telegram was part of that. People know what the Zimmerman telegram was? Okay. I think it was March, early March 1917. Arthur Zimmerman, who's the foreign minister of Germany, sends what I call in the book perhaps the stupidest diplomatic note ever written in history, certainly in modern history, in which he sends a note, a telegram in code to the Mexican government, offering that if the U.S. and Germany go to war, that the Mexicans should attack the United States, and if they do, when the Germans win the war against the United States, they will make sure the Mexicans get back the states in the Southwest that the United States had taken from them, which, as you probably know, included California, most of Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, part of Utah. Well, of course, this was, ridiculously, it was stupid because in so many ways. The Mexicans were involved in their own revolution, first of all, fighting amongst each other, and also they had no capability, of course, to battle the United States military, which was growing gradually, was still more powerful than the Mexican military, which was not united anyway. But it's interesting, there's been pretty close studies of newspaper opinion after the Zimmerman telegram was released. They proved, at least to my satisfaction, that didn't change that many minds, actually. Probably because this thing, it's so outrageous, Now, if the Mexicans actually acted on it, it would have been a different matter, but most people just said, this guy must be, loony. And, if the German's foreign minister is this stupid, we don't have much to fear. Obviously, it was headlined everywhere, but my relative, Barbara Tuchman, wrote a book about the Zimmerman telegram, which she sort of straddled that issue. But there's better ones which have come out recently. I mean, Barbara was a very fine historian, but better ones have come out recently, which argue that it didn't make that much difference. What made the difference in the end was American ships were being sunk, not very many. American lives were being lost, not very many, between February and March 1917. Newspapers were playing them up. And also something else important to underline, I mentioned this in my book. Wilson had portrayed himself and had been believed to be a figure who wanted to keep the U.S. neutral up until February 1917. As I said, people in the anti-war movement believed they could win him over, to be truly neutral, to make a pledge never to go to the war, never to get the United States into the war. Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge, his good friend in the Senate, and other leading Northeastern Republicans, especially, were very much in favor of the war, as was Senator Harding, and so Wilson seemed like when Wilson changed his mind, a lot of people said, well, if Wilson changed his mind, it must be okay. And remember, the Democrats were the majority party in Congress at that time. If Wilson had lost the 1916 election to Charles Evans Hughes, the Republican, whose foreign policy would have been made by Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge and other pro-war Republicans, a lot more Democrats would have opposed going to war, including probably the Speaker of the House, a guy named Champ Clark from Missouri, who wasn't crazy about the war anyway, but supported going to war because he had to support his president, his Democratic president. Partisanship was obviously, as now, very important. So I think it's important to realize how historians talk about contingency. It really matters. Nothing is that foreordained. Some things perhaps are. Death is, taxes are, but nothing really else is. But it's really important, I think, to realize that few things had changed. Like if Charles Evans Hughes had won, I think it's 1,910 more votes in California, and Woodrow Wilson had won that many less. Hughes would have won California, and with it, he would have won the Electoral College majority, though not a popular majority. And he would have won the election. It would have been a little like 2016, though they're very different issues, very different candidates, but and much closer, actually, the electoral vote. So that would have made the anti-war movement would have had a much easier time making their arguments, I think. Yes.
Since Britain and France would, at the end, were welcoming America's involvement and
Pleading for it. Yeah.
What was the response of Britain and France to the anti-war movement
Yeah.
in America?
That's a good question. Well, there was an anti-war movement in Britain, and those who opposed the draft. Britain didn't have a draft in 1916. They depended on volunteers, but then they weren't getting enough volunteers, and people were dying, in large numbers on the Western Front. So, and also in the Mideast. British started a draft, and there was an anti-draft movement, including Bertrand Russell, the famous philosopher, a very important leader of that anti-draft movement at the time. The British government, worked behind the scenes with Colonel House, who was much more in favor of going to the war than Wilson was, I think, with the American ambassador to Great Britain, who made it pretty clear he thought the United States should go to war after Lusitania was torpedoed. The French were more complicated. The French had a very, of course, not much of an anti-war movement, not surprisingly, because they were they were invaded, and the guy who would have been the leader of their movement, Jean Jaurès, the leader of the Socialist Party, was assassinated right before the war began by a pro-war Frenchman. But the French also had a pro-war lobby, of course, in this country. So, they thought the anti-war movement was a problem, and they were afraid. There's lots of letters from the American ambassador in Britain to Wilson, and then to the guy Robert Lansing, who replaced Bryan as Secretary of State, worried about the impact of the movement, worried about what if we go to war, will there be a lot more sabotage by Americans, not just by Germans? There was some sabotage by Germans before the U.S. gets to the war. So, it was seen as a problem, certainly. But Wilson was enough of a good politician and diplomat to make sure that the British and the French knew. First of all, it was clear to everybody, if the U.S. got into the war, it would not be on the side of the Germans. I mean, that was never going to happen for some of the reasons I mentioned. And also, Roosevelt was very good friends with the French ambassador, for example, and Roosevelt was an important figure, of course, in the Republican Party. So I'm rambling, but basically, the British and the French were worried about the anti-war movement, but they thought they had good friends in the United States who could defeat it, if necessary. Other questions? Yeah, one more question, sir?
I just want to go back to the Zimmerman note.
Yeah.
I want to get your feedback. I think it's kind of curious. The British certainly did want us to enter the war. We know that they've done a number of backdoor attempts to encourage these both in the First and Second World War. Second World War, dropping leaflets from supposedly Nostradamus over the Germans, and Operation Bodyguard, where it looks like there's going to be some ruse coming across Calais. Coming across the channel toward Calais. So I just wonder, the Zimmerman note was received by the U.S. government through British channels, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's one of the, again, one of the idiocies of it is that the British were reading all these cables that came from the Germans.
What's the chances that this was fabricated by the British? I mean, it's
Well, that was talking about, but at first actually, Crystal Eastman put out a note saying this must have been fabricated by the British. But then the Germans admitted it, that they had written it. So that pretty much did away with that. So, great, thank you very much.